Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. This is episode 2 in our 3-part series about B2B e-commerce opportunities, barriers to adoption, and action points for B2B sellers that want to start to adopt digital sales channels. And I'm joined once again by my amazing guests, KHALID Khan from Arsenalia Group and VIKRAM SAXENA from Better Commerce. Welcome again, gentlemen, to the pod.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Vikram.
To be back, guys.
It's
Looking
amazing.
forward to more.
Me too. It's amazing to have you both on the podcast once again. Our previous episode in the series, this 3-part series, was really good. We were able to talk about and demonstrate some of the very clear and present opportunities for B2B sellers to start to execute on the massive opportunity that is digital commerce, what some of those opportunities look like in detail, all the way from EDI to punch out to self-service e-commerce to the digital services layer, all the way down to the digitalization of both product and customer data so that we can serve customers at scale without breaking the backs of our businesses. So this was a fantastic foundational first conversation. Now, the second conversation that we're going to have today is about some of the typical barriers to adoption that we have witnessed and we have seen in the market, and some of the ways in which we believe that these brands can start to deal with, attack, and address some of these challenges to adoption that we have seen. And perhaps maybe even referencing some of the experiences that we've seen some brands go through and the transformation that we've seen some of these brands go through as they go along the journey of adoption. What are some of the things that we see as foundational barriers? Meaning, what is it that the brands that we speak to day in and day out, what are some of the things they're communicating to us that they're saying, hey, whoa, cool. Maybe we believe even at the highest levels of business that this is an important area that we need to get better in, that we need to execute on, but we either don't know how or where to start, or we've encountered other barriers to adoption within our business. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm very excited about having this conversation. So maybe I'll turn the floor over to you, KHALID, to start off with, and maybe you can share from the trenches some of the things that you hear day in and day out as to why some of these B2B sellers have been reticent or hesitant to adopt digital sales and service channels. And in many cases, these brands are second, third, and in some cases, 4th generation family B2B businesses. And they've always done it a certain way. And this whole digital thing is a real challenge for them.
Yeah, I'm quite lucky in my job because I get to talk to a lot of different businesses. And part of my job is engaging with new clients. One of the things I hear often is this concern that we don't just sell T-shirts or trainers online or for our transatlantic audience, sneakers. We've got a very complicated product. It's a complicated configuration. There's regulation around our product. And this feeling that our business is not easily transferable to the digital realm. It doesn't translate like a T-shirt seller might do. And then when you compound that with some of the complexities in the B2B world, when you think about just even moving beyond products, okay, so we've got the complexity of products, configuration, pricing, of course, is not single price. There could be tens of thousands. In some cases I've seen with projects, clients I've worked on, hundreds of thousands of prices per SKU. There's also what I call the intangibles. The big part of the B2B world is the additional things that you sell over and above your products, the warranties, the service agreements. So these intangibles, the insurances, etc. Again, there's a concern that these are not physical products. How can they be transferred, to the digital space? Then also I remember an interesting case with a steel manufacturer where the way they sold their production was through auctions. So they had this live auction format So again, the way in which they sell, whether it's auction, there's some business that work on bids. So this whole perception that our business is far more complex and therefore it won't transfer easily into the digital space.
Wow, it feels like there's an almost unlimited number of barriers in some of these brands' minds about how they can adopt digital channels. Vikram, what are some of the things that you see brands running into day in and day out, or barriers that they say, hey, look, this is great, but we think this is going to be really difficult?
Yeah. So what I have primarily come across is just the typical starting point is we've been doing it this way for generations. And that's always the first starting point, and it has worked. I came across a B2B business which was turning around approximately 70 to 80 million pounds a year. And their website had a catalog in PDF format. Now, this was not very far off, really. This was just 2, 3 years ago. So if you think of something like that in today's day and age, people could still just put up their PDF catalog and think, and what the business is it's going on. And so I think it's very important that for people to see that this evolution is going to happen. And once this is one starting point, that it has always worked this way, and we are happy with this working like this, that typical mindset. Secondary challenge is their lack of understanding of the technology, and add this factor that Khalid just mentioned about this can't be translated to digital. They think it's about almost like sending a rocket to the moon. It isn't. I mean, in today's day and age, doing a digital business is not like sending a rocket to the moon. But somewhere in their back of their mind, and also one thing I've seen is that some of them have burned their fingers. That I know a friend who tried to do it digitally, invested a lot of money. We invested 2 years, $250,000 into it, but we did not get anywhere. And we tried best of the technologies that were available. For whatever reasons, I think these are the primary constraints or barriers that stop them from even thinking about it, taking the first baby steps towards it in the right direction.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and we can probably do multiple episodes just on this alone.
Yes.
One of the biggest factors I see and I run into on a regular basis, and I'd love you guys' take on this, is the people factor. It's the human factor, right? It's a combination of two elements to the human factor. One is internal resistance, and we talked a little bit about this in the first episode. Resistance, say, from sales teams, or resistance from customer service, or resistance from ops, or resistance from IT. And we discussed in our first episode that this is both a challenge but also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to give your team members superpowers. It's an opportunity to take away the most painful parts of their day. It's an opportunity to take away the most painful parts of their job that they hate, that they feel is soul destroying, that adds no value to them or their customers. So that's a double-edged sword. But then there's the second piece to the human factor, which is, and I hear this all the time, that's great. It's easy for you. You've been working in this space for a long time, but we can't find anybody to help us. We can't hire, like we've tried to hire people. We've tried to hire an e-commerce manager, or we've tried to hire a head of digital or a CDO, but there's nobody out there in the market that seems to understand B2B. Maybe they have digital skills. Maybe they can even do digital marketing. Maybe they even understand digital sales channels. Maybe they even understand even self-service e-commerce, but they don't understand EDI. They don't understand punch out. They don't understand B2B sales processes. They don't understand our B2B product complexity. They don't understand CPQ. They don't understand all these things that are relevant to our business. So not only do we have internal resistance, but they feel like they can't go into the market and hire somebody competent enough to be able to help level up their skills internally so that they can execute on this opportunity. Are you seeing the human factor at play in some of these decisions to not go forward with digital?
Absolutely. I think after they have crossed the initial two barriers that Khalid and myself talked about, the third biggest factor comes into play is the human and the skill and the expertise factor, which you talked about. And that, firstly, get over that mindset, get over that readiness. Okay, we are now ready, open, bring that openness, that, okay, we're now open to do it. But then comes the factor, who is going to do it and who's going to drive it? And that's where this becomes even a daunting task to find the right person to drive that whole initiative, because you have to be a little bit, I wouldn't say hands-on, but you have to be in the know-how of it, not the nitty-gritties, but at least from an solution architectural perspective to understand a little bit to drive that initiative correctly. And this is a huge barrier as well. Human capital. In technology, human capital is the biggest capital, actually.
And once you get beyond that, even beyond, let's say, finding let's say the new skill set, the new wave of thinking that can drive this. The other challenge is around change management. How do you get your existing
Rest of the org.
Yeah, your existing workforce, as you said before, Vikram, people are used to doing, we're creatures of habit. We like habit, we like our routine. If it works, it's fine, it's working. The fact that it's got 5 band-aids to make it work, it doesn't matter. The point is it's working. So how do you get the people on the front line? And of course, B2B commerce touches every part of the organization. So how can you drive adoption? How can you get people to start thinking in a different way? Again, from what I found, this is a real big area that's often overlooked and not really considered, given the weight that it needs to be given, because it's all well and good investing in technology and people, etc. But if you can't use and adopt and take advantage of the whole new kind of capability that you've created, it's of limited value. Yeah, I find that change management is a very big consideration that needs a lot of thought.
And just to add in there, as a young kid, I'd read it somewhere, education is too important to be left only for the educators. It is the responsibility of the whole society and everywhere that you go. And like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. It is exactly the same with this commerce adoption as well. It takes the whole company to make it success. A lot of times I've seen that they will make one person responsible, but the challenge is that one person does not have the full authority over the whole business. He can only drive certain part and educate others, but at the end, the drive and the authority has to be there to drive it properly and synchronously.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 approaches I've seen most brands take to this challenge of the people factor or the human factor. One is, and I've seen them do it successfully both ways. One is to look across your business and say, is there somebody in our business that has a natural interest in this, that has a natural affinity for this, that maybe doesn't have all the skill set yet, but they're just interested. They might come from the sales team, or they might come from the ops team, or they might be, come from customer service, or someone who's a little bit more technical, or they might come from the product development team, or they might come from some area of the business that you wouldn't necessarily naturally think, oh, this person is going to make a great digital commerce executive or specialist or an e-commerce manager. Oftentimes there is someone in the business that would be interested in being upskilled, trained, supported externally, either by a consultancy or an agency or a partner of some variety that can get them up to speed and can support them through that educational process until they're ready to take over that kind of leadership role in the business. That's the first thing, and is that there's almost always someone in the business that knows the B2B side of the business inside and out, but they have a natural interest or affinity for digital. And it might be a millennial, one of your millennial employees, or it might be the grandchild of the founder who's come into the business to start taking over running certain elements of the business, or they might be the new CEO of the business. And so they are a digital native because they're a millennial. So there almost always is somewhere a champion, a digital champion that you can identify somewhere in the business that you can train up and school up. The second approach that I've seen work is to go to the market and find someone who maybe is a D2C or a B2C e-commerce specialist, because there's a lot more of those out there than there are the unicorns who know B2B inside and out and who know digital inside and out. Those are unicorns, right? And even if you can find them, you'll probably have to pay them $500,000 a year to come and work inside your business. And so therefore, one of the other approaches I've seen work, go to the market, find someone who's an absolute digital superstar, an absolute weapon. They can come into the business, and then you can teach them all the particularities of the B2B aspects of commerce. You can get them up to speed on your product catalog. You can get them up to speed on how you currently do sales today, the sales process. You can get them up to speed on your current technology stack and your back-end services. You can get them up to speed on how you fulfill products and who your buyers are and what the buyer journey looks like and how you can augment that buyer journey through digital sales channels and digital service channels. So I've seen both of those two approaches work equally well. Are you guys seeing something similar in the market?
Yes, Jason. In fact, it's a very interesting thing that you mentioned, find people inside your business. Recently, I came across a scenario where a guy who was working in the warehouse doing pick, pack, ship actually elevated his own skill set and reached out to the technology division saying that I want to do a more tech oriented role. And then they did a basic interview for him and got him in the tech team. And as of today, he manages their whole Azure DevOps.
Wow.
That's incredible. And of course, I think because this brings a huge set of benefit. The person is already familiar with the business culture, how things work, who are the right people, where are they placed, what are the rights, roles, and responsibilities, and what levers to trigger to get something done. It's much quicker and efficient, right? He would know that. Plus, if he's been there in the business for a little while, there's loyalty factor in there. And you need somebody who's been in the business, who understands it really well to drive that change management. Bringing somebody up from outside to drive that, I have observed always has higher level of resistance. It takes them longer time to understand the mechanics of the business and what are the right levers to push at what time, because that is the critical part. No matter how well oiled your processes are, you still need to be very well familiar what levers to push when. You push the wrong lever at the wrong time, everything will go blast. In terms of people itself, I'm not even talking about system. So I think finding people inside I've seen work much better rather than bringing consultants from outside. Of course you can, but what I've observed in the past is inside people elevate their skills, find the right people with the right attitude. Skills can be developed, attitude is very difficult to develop. You can just find it, either you have it or you don't have it. Find the right people with the attitude, do a little bit of training, coaching, and elevate them.
Whoever the leader is, or the champion, the ambassador, whatever phrase you want to use, it's crucial that the entire board, the leadership, is behind that particular champion ambassador. Absolutely. Because again, for the evolution, the change to be effective, it's going to touch every part of the organization. And it's important that all the different stakeholders within the business, the leadership, put the weight behind the initiative. And I think that's super important to make sure at a board level, at a leadership level, there's consensus and there's kind of ownership and interest and desire, drive, motivation to make this thing a success.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now, one of the other things I see regularly, it's a two-pronged challenge that has a similar root cause. One is that many of these B2B businesses, they have a tremendous amount of technical debt that they're dealing with, right? So they've got maybe a legacy ERP, maybe they have even a legacy PIM system, maybe they've got a legacy custom system integration middleware platform that they've spent many years and many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars building out. They have this combination of technical debt combined with project fatigue. So I go in and I see not only do they have a lot of legacy technology that's been configured maybe in a legacy way that they would need to update, in addition to just before they even can do e-commerce in any way, shape, or form, they need to maybe update to the latest version of their ERP, for example. Maybe they have an on-prem version and they need to upgrade to the cloud version or the SaaS version of their ERP because it will make it easier to system integrate with other systems and e-commerce platforms. Or maybe they've got, I go in oftentimes and sometimes they even need to re-platform their back office before they can even think about doing their front office. Or as we talked about in a previous episode, maybe they need to update the data model, the product data model, or the customer data model, or the pricing model inside their legacy systems before they can start adopting these new digital routes to market. So that's the first thing. And then secondarily, oftentimes when I go in, maybe they've tried and failed before to implement an e-commerce system. Maybe I don't know, maybe they've tried to use WooCommerce for B2B, for example. And I'm helping a number of clients right now who have spent the last few years trying to implement WooCommerce, trying to customize it, trying to use apps, trying to twist and turn. They turn WooCommerce into a pretzel, trying to accommodate their needs through radical customization. And so when they even first launched that e-commerce website, they launched with technical debt because it was so highly customized. They had to customize the bejesus out of it to make it do even remotely what they needed it to do. And the team is just worn out. The team has said, the team were promised the world. Then when something was implemented, it didn't stack up. It actually made their lives harder rather than easier. And they're going, geez, we've spent the last couple of years trying to do this whole digital commerce thing. It has been an absolute nightmare. We spent a ton of money on it. We've got a whole ton of technical debt in the back office and the front office. We're just not ready to do this. So it's a combination of technical debt across the business combined with project fatigue that is oftentimes the barrier to wanting to move forward with any kind of new capability in the business. Do you guys see this too?
Yeah, this saddens me, if I'm honest, Jason. I mean, being in the industry, and I'm fortunate to have worked on both sides of the fence. So I've worked for a commerce vendor, and I've certainly spent a lot of years working on agency system integration side of the fence. So I've seen it from both sides, but it saddens me that the truth is, I think sometimes we as an industry have failed some of our end user clients. I've seen it many times where system integrators, partners have come in, and they're quite literally painting with too large a paintbrush, just really being very ambitious and drawing up very complex, large programs. And then likewise, from the vendor perspective, it's a cliche, but it's true. I've seen it firsthand as a system integrator working for a client where they've been promised the sun and the stars for this particular solution. And then they sign the license agreement, and then the implementation partner's there to support them. And then they realize that some of the functionality that they thought they were going to get is actually not ready yet. It's in beta, it's on the roadmap, it's coming next year, it's coming next quarter, etc. As someone who works with clients and is engaged to be the adult in the room in some cases, to be the trusted advisor, it does sadden me to see this happen quite often, more often than I would like. But yeah, this certainly, I think we as an industry have got some responsibility. And I think what's needed is just a kind of a sober, so the approach I take is what I call sequential transformation. I understand the bigger picture. I want to really understand what the North Star is, where we want to get to, and then make sure we set realistic timelines, but then break that down into small, digestible pieces of transformation. And it's driven by value. So we want to, and even for us as an agency, we need to build trust. Trust is earned. You've got to earn trust through performance. You can't talk someone into trusting you. That only goes so far. So that the approach we take is to deliver small pieces of value. So we'll break down a complex transformation project, deliver something, demonstrate value, get buy-in, move on to the next thing, deliver value, get buy-in, move on to the next thing. So yeah, there's definitely fatigue. The industry is littered. Again, it's a family show, so I'll keep some of those names in my head. But the people listening, the audience, veterans in the industry, can name many examples that we've all seen and are witnessing today, where perhaps there is this fatigue. Sadly, there is this phenomenon where the client is sadly not in a good situation. Perhaps they're being ill-advised, and oftentimes just through lack of knowledge, through ignorance, the clients themselves, they don't know any better. They trust their own instinct or an internal or an external advisor, and that sadly that engagement probably in hindsight wasn't the best. So yeah, I do see that often.
And just to add on to that, interestingly, we recently onboarded a customer, Jason, on our platform for B2B. And they had been trying to get the B2B thing work on Shopify for last 1.5, 2 years. And they'd spent almost to the tune of $250,000, and they'd not got anywhere close. Their website, the current website, was still pretty much a static website. And within about 3 to 4 months, their new B2B driven website with all of their requirements, custom pricing, the new way of navigation that they wanted was all up and running. So like KHALID said, it is heartbreaking to see sometimes when a lot of these businesses are promised the moon and the stars, for whatever reasons, and they don't deliver, and then they're not delivered. And then, of course, it causes a lot of frustration. And there is a saying in India, somebody burnt with the milk, with a hot milk, will even be cautious of the water as well, just a cold water. Touching that as well, he will be very cautious. So it just builds that mindset over a period of time, and then they become extra cautious. And that adds to their overall barrier of going digital. Because majority of these business owners, they're not techie. You can't expect them to understand techie. They understand that business, they understand that market, and how to sell to their customers, what is the value that they deliver to their customers. You can't expect them. And then they're promised all of this, which technically ends up being very shallow promises, and that hurts the whole industry.
Yeah, one thing I will say, having sat through a lot of different commerce vendor presentations, particularly I'm talking about B2C here. I tell you now, I can get 4 B2C vendors in a room, present to a potential client. And at the end of the day, the client will be completely confused. We've got more acronyms in our industry than any other industry. I mean, it's a literal alphabet soup of acronyms and buzzwords, and just so much marketing talk.
Yeah.
And I think it's become, and naturally, if we look at the democratization of the internet, we look at the distillation of commerce technology, we've gone from having, you never got fired from buying certain vendors, down to a situation now we've got so many SaaS solutions and microservices. So it's so distilled, it's so fragmented, there's so many vendors offering so many things. And I think it's quite daunting for clients, prospects, to try and navigate this very complex vendor landscape, solution landscape. And I think they often get overwhelmed. And I think, again, it's quite a difficult challenge for them to try and make sense of this. And of course, in B2B, we see a lot of B2C solutions masquerading as being a good fit for B2B. And again, that happens quite often. They see an opportunity in B2B, and it's just, again, it's a marketing retrofit, as I call it. Now suddenly today they're wearing a B2B hat. And there's a shortage of really good, solid, from the ground up B2B first commerce vendors and platforms out there. And I think it's hard for the buyer to just navigate this complex vendors landscape to try and find the right solution. So to your point, if you start off with the wrong tool in the first place, the probability of failure is quite high.
And I think also the challenge is exacerbated by agencies that can only specialize in 1, 2, maybe 3. Even if they are B2B e-commerce specialists, it's very difficult to specialize in more than 3 platforms. So the reality is, if all you've got is a hammer, every challenge starts to look like a nail. And so the reality is that agencies are going to try to shoehorn you into one of the platforms they develop on so that they can win the business, right, at the end of the day. And so they're gonna push you in a certain direction to try to land the deal, when that may not serve you the best, especially and I find this most common with legacy B2C and D2C agencies that are now trying to add B2B as a string to their bow, but they haven't historically serviced the B2B market at all. And so they're trying to learn as well. They're learning on the fly. They're learning through customer engagements. And so they themselves don't necessarily even know how to do discovery around B2B. They don't necessarily know how to scope or do solutioning for B2B. They don't know how to do platform search and select for B2B that matches their customers' requirements appropriately. And so they themselves are at the mercy of the vendor demos. They're at the mercy of what the vendors tell them the platform can do. And so it's a catch-22. And sometimes it takes someone like me or someone who's more independent, who's not trying to sell you follow-on services. They're not trying to sell you agency services and implementation services. And they're there purely to help you get the best possible outcome from both your tech selection and the scoped project. And to your point, KHALID, trying to help you define what a stepping stone approach might look like and road mapping this into the business so that you're not biting off more than you can chew. And so I KHALID, to your point, I see this day in and day out, failed projects, miserable customers, lied to customers that have been burnt. They're unhappy. They're sad. They know they have to make a move, but they're absolutely petrified to take a misstep again, both in terms of time, money, team frustration, project fatigue. They're just terrified and they feel like a deer in the headlights. And that's a very scary place for a B2B seller to find themselves, isn't it?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Jason. Absolutely. Most of the merchants, B2B merchants I talk to, they literally sound like that.
Yeah.
Deer in front of the headlight.
And they sound defeated oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they're like, we know we have to do something, but we don't know what to do. And we've been burnt before, and we put a whole ton of money into something that didn't work out the way we thought it was going to work out. So we're terrified of even making the next step. But I think the key thing to remember for these businesses is no matter how badly you've been burnt, no matter how much technical debt that you may have, no matter how much project fatigue you might have, the world is not going to stop. The market is not going to stop. The expectations of your customers are not going to stop changing. And so therefore, it's incumbent upon us as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as team members there to support our teams to keep trying. Maybe what you, and what I point out, what I try to point out, there's a silver lining even in this. There's a silver lining in being burnt. There's a silver lining in having project fatigue. There's a silver lining is that you now have gotten an education. This is, even if you completely throw out a $250,000 implementation, what remains is the learning. What remains is the education. What remains are the lessons that you learned through that process. So it makes you better. It is a part of exercising the digital muscle, right? And you now know when you go into that next engagement, better questions to ask, better preparation that you need to do, and how to structure a deal to hold your vendor partners' feet to the fire in terms of delivery, and how to structure a project for a better likelihood of success. So it's not all a waste. And this is what I try to coach clients through. I try to teach them, hey, look, I know it feels bad right now, and you might be at, we say ebb and flow, you might be at an ebb right now, but I tell you, you're much closer to the flow than you might think because of the education you just got over the last 2 years of pain. Humans, we don't learn when things are going smoothly. We don't learn when things are going right. We don't learn when everything's just sailing along on calm waters. We learn by being burnt. It's just like the kid when they put their hand on the stove as a child. We don't learn when everything's going fine. We learn when we put our hand on a hot stove as, oh my God, I burned my hand. I got to do that again. That's how we learn as human beings and as adults, isn't it?
And let's also recognize that investment climate is different today than it was in the height of COVID. I mean, in COVID, also one of the reasons I saw is in the COVID, the hype in digital commerce and the big upswings that everybody was seeing. I mean, there was this kind of very, I would say, kind of investment pro approach. We must ride this wave. We must take advantage.
Splashy cashy.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we've seen now is a correction. As I said, I think that adults have taken back control, which was needed. And there's a more sober approach to investment. And I welcome this. I think this is more sustainable. This is the right approach to take, where kind of cash is very carefully invested. You need a lot more than just a fancy presentation and a silver-tongued salesperson to get buy-in on a particular investment. You've got to really demonstrate value. It's got to really make sense. It's got to be achievable. We talked about timelines, etc., project delivery risk, etc. So I think what we see now is a more sustainable, more realistic appetite for risk and investment that I think is going to serve us well in the long run, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Khalid. I think in the long term, it's always going to be good. But Jason, you said life is a great teacher. The only bloody problem is it's very expensive.
Yeah, but I tell you, the most expensive lessons are the ones we remember the most. You know, there is enough even to that. Now, one of the other things that I encounter daily is a lack of pre-planning around adoption. So research planning in terms of canvassing customers, talking to customers, having conversations with them, doing discovery with them for what they consider e-commerce. What do they consider important digital services that they would like to consume from you? Internal adoption planning. Before we ever even get into scoping, before we ever get into solution architecture, before we ever get into platform search and select, I encourage my clients to do adoption planning as the first step, as the first phase. Because if you don't do that, then this massive investment that you're about to make is unlikely to see ROI, because you will probably scope the wrong thing. You'll probably scope the wrong functionality. You'll scope the wrong solution. You will select the wrong technology. So even if you go out and you buy the Ferrari, if your customers aren't interested in that, then you're going to have a problem on your hands. And what I found is that oftentimes in the B2B world, to your point, Khalid, even the terminology that the industry uses is a language all of its own. We don't use the term in B2B click and collect. It's called will call, for example. We don't call it a subscription service. We call it auto replenishment, right? Or auto fulfillment, right? Or setting a min-max that is shared with a supplier, right? So the terminology, the language, even the processes are very different in the B2B world. And one of the things I'm often tasked with is coming in and leading my clients' conversation with their clients to assess whether their clients even want them to offer e-commerce and what that actually means to them as the buyer. Because they don't use the term e-commerce. They'll use terms like buyer's portal. They use the term like trade portal. They'll say, hey, we'd like to be able to place our orders through Slack or WhatsApp or email, or here we'd like to send you a PDF or a CSV, or they say, hey, look, we'd like to be able to just track. We would be happy just to be able to track our order from online between the time it leaves your warehouse and arrives in our warehouse. We'd be happy with that. Or we'd be happy just to be able to request a quote online without having to send an email to you and then wait for you to send an email back with a quote, right? We'd love to be able to do that, or lodge returns online. Even if we couldn't hit the buy now button or make the transaction online, we'd love to have all these other services online. And so I think that there is a lack of conversations happening and taking your customers on the journey right from the scoping phase into the build phase, into the test phase, into the launch phase, and selecting a cohort of customers. And I tell them, I say, look, you need to go out to your customer base and select a small group of 3 different cohorts to talk to. One is a small cohort of customers that you think would adopt your digital channels instantly the moment they're available, because they've already told you they would adopt them. 2, pick a small cohort of customers that are on the fence, that have told you, if you offered e-commerce, I might use it, or I probably use it, but then again, I might not. I quite like Bob, or I quite like Jane, my account manager, and I quite like doing business through them. So I'm on the fence. And then pick a small cohort of customers that you think would never adopt digital channels, no matter how good they were and no matter how good the services were. You need to be talking to all 3 cohorts of customers to understand what they want from you, so that you're actually building something that is relevant to your customer base, so that when you launch, you're not praying and hoping that both your internal team and your external team adopts the channel for a fact that they will if you build it in this way. This is something that I think most brands have no idea how to do. First of all, they don't even think to do it. And second of all, if they think to do it, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do internal and external adoption planning at all. And it's something people like us have to assist with.
Absolutely. I think, Jason, I would say a lot of times there is still a little bit of internal planning probably is still there, but external is almost non-existent.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, we're talking about the seller, but you might find the buyers are more motivated even than the seller to have a digital portal or whatever it might be. So yeah, they're the people that you're serving. And also, let's not forget the average B2B business, the average B2B buyer they've got fewer buyers as a generalization, and those buyers have got the CLV is higher than a typical, let's say, D2C consumer. It's a stickier relationship. The dynamic is completely different. You're often selling on credit. There's this whole kind of trust dimension. It's a whole different relationship. It's a much deeper, stickier, and of course the numbers are often completely different. Each buyer, the amount of money that they spend is completely different compared to the B2C world. So yeah, the dynamic is different. You'll find the motivation often from the buyer is just as much, if not even greater, than the seller to get this right.
And they're willing to tell you what's, in my experience, when I lead these conversations, they're willing, because if you just ask them, do you want us to offer e-commerce? Oftentimes the answer is no, I don't really care.
Yeah.
So you have to contextualize the questions in such a way that's actually relevant to the buyer experience. So when I go in and I start leading these conversations on behalf of the seller, I'm asking them, would it be useful if you could log in and you could self-serve product information from a buyer's portal, that you could download spec sheets, you could see images of the product, you could see fitment of the product, you could filter for products in different categories, that you could see whether it's in stock, out of stock, you could find out how much inventory somebody has, you could find out the MOQ of the product, you could find out the buying increment of the product, that you could, would that be helpful? If you could log in and you could manage your returns and your quote requests and download previous invoices because your accounts payable team needs to download an invoice so that it can be paid, or check the status of a credit account instead of having to email the CFO or the accounts team on the seller side. If you could self-service all that, would that be helpful to you? So it's about contextualizing the questions in such a way that you're soliciting feedback on all the most painful parts of interfacing and engaging with the business as a seller. Like, what is the most challenge? And that's oftentimes how I will open, like, I'll open the conversation by saying, what is your favorite thing about buying off of this supplier? What is your favorite thing? What do they do better than anybody else? What do you love about it? And secondarily, what is the thing you hate the most? What is the most challenging thing about doing business with the supplier? What do you hate? What is causing you pain? What is causing you to waste time, additional resources, etc.? What would make, if you could change one thing about the way that you engage with the supplier, what would it be? And this, if you can start getting them spilling the beans, so to speak, on their relationship with the supplier, man, they will, I tell you, they'll be pretty blunt, especially if the supplier is not in the room. And so I think there's a case to be made for having an independent third party come in and help you with both internal and external adoption planning, because oftentimes internal teams and external parties will be honest with a third party in ways they will not be. If I have a great relationship with Bob, my account manager, and he's the one that's taking me to the ball games, and he's the one that's schmoozing with me, and he's the one that, we go to beers every Friday at the local pub, and it's unlikely he's going to say, you guys are pretty shit at X, Y, and Z. It's unlikely, right? So you need to be able to get to a place where you can solicit bluntly honest feedback from your customers. If you want to have any chance at a high adoption rate, you have to create an environment where they feel safe to be blunt.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Jason. I think this is a very valid point, that businesses, before even adoption planning, internal and external, both should be done. As of now, I don't think any business ever thinks about it. I have not come across many ones actually doing this proactively.
I think the second part of this, and I'd love you to on this, both of you, not only internal and external adoption planning, but what is it going to take to operate these systems effectively and at scale? Meaning that, sure, it's great that you might have your internal sales team that's on board with this and is trying to push their customers towards these digital sales channels. But if you adopt a personalization platform or a marketing automation platform as part of this digital stack, if you implement a PIM as part of this stack, or it's part of the commerce platform, whatever, what kind of resources? Because oftentimes these sellers, they have no idea what kind of team they're going to need to develop internally once these systems are live. What are they going to need internally to run and operate these systems at scale? Because they don't want to be dependent on an agency forever just to operate these systems day to day for BAU, business as usual. They want to be able to own these systems internally themselves. And so sometimes they're promised the earth, but what the vendor might not tell them, okay, you're going to need a team of 3 to operate this system to get the most out of it. We've got a Ferrari here, and you've bought a Ferrari, but you need 3 individuals in the business to run it, to operate. You need a pit crew of 3 people to operate this Ferrari. Otherwise, you're not going to get any value out of it. And that's a conversation I see just not being had. And there's a lack of transparency in this world. Back to your point, KHALID, I think it's incumbent upon us who work in this space to be pretty blunt. You're going to need a team of people to extract value and ROI out of this investment post live. And here's what that kind of looks like. Do you have that capability, or are you going to need to hire it?
Yeah, this goes back to what I said in the last episode about, for sure, technology is a big part of this, but I describe it as a downstream consideration. What a lot of time needs to be spent beforehand, before we even get to technology, addressing these types of issues and having these conversations up front. I think, again, there's almost sometimes an impatience. The thinking is, right, let's just go and buy the next shiny new piece of tech and we'll make it work. Definitely upfront, these kinds of conversations need to be had. And this, along with a number of other issues. We've not even touched, for example, the complexity around commercial agreements. The legal landscape in B2B is very different. There's a whole host of complexity around kind of distribution rights, exclusivity rights,
permits,
compliance, permits, ESG, all kinds of complexity. And then, of course, you need the processes. What about the processes to support that kind of, and then all these things need to be worked out first. And I think that the technology needs to essentially serve or deliver this whole expectation plan that's being created in discussions, in boardrooms, in breakout rooms, etc. And then the technology, to me, comes towards the end of the process, where you're very clear on what to do, what the expectations are, how you get live, what happens, to your point, Jason, what happens post go live, what are the requirements, what are the processes, do we have everything in place, the adoption, the change management. These are really important things that need to be hashed out first. And again, it goes back to what we said before. Again, this is how you mitigate risk. I mean, these are smart investments that need to be made, relatively small investments early on. Have these uncomfortable, difficult conversations now in a breakout room. It's a safe space. Like we say, a stitch in time saves 9 is something my mother always used to say to me. So yeah, I agree.
One thing to add is, I think majority of these project implementations, all the focus is around, let's write down these specs, align on it, implement, and go live. There is very rarely enough thought put into what happens after go live. What is going to be the operating model? Of course, they will ask questions. What is the support model? How are you going to support us from a vendor perspective? But there is nobody who's asking the question across anywhere, because it's a holistic question. How are you going to operate this software once it goes live? That question is somewhat missing from the whole equation, I think. And like KHALID said, that has to be put together. That process, people mapping, has to be put together beforehand, even before you get started. And it should be given equal amount of importance, just like going live is important. I remember studying some book in Shakespeare where it said, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. To become the king is nothing, but to remain a successful king is everything. Going live is important, but it's not the end of the world. Now, being live sustainably, running successfully, keeping the lights green at all the times, and deriving value out of it, that is.
It's interesting that you make that point, because what I find is that so when I help a merchant draft a BRD, a business requirements document, we have the functional requirements, which is maybe 50% of the document. But I find that 50% of the document is the non-functional requirements. What are the testing requirements? What are the training requirements? What are the post-live support requirements, both by the vendor and the agency partner that would be doing the post-live support and enhancements and road mapping? I find that non-functional requirements are a very significant portion of the overall business requirement, or at least they should be, because if they're not, then it means you probably haven't dug deep enough into what your needs are going to be post live from both your vendor partner and your agency or your implementation partners, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is, Jason, all of these non-functional requirements have been boilerplated.
Yes.
So any agency you go to, they're just going to pick the standard template and copy paste it.
Yes. Yes.
Because not many people on the client end would understand it at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And majority of the time,
we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly.
So we're relying on our partners.
Exactly. And they're 6 months after you've gone live, I mean, the document is drafted today. It'll take 3 to 6 months going live. Nobody's going to go back to that document after 6 months when you've gone live. You are focused more on the current open issues, what needs to be sorted out, how to get it all working properly if there are any issues, and how to get started. Nobody's going to go back to that document after that point in time. I strongly believe it should be a separate document, operating model outside the business requirement and specification document, which should be given its due weightage and importance at the right time with the right stakeholders involved. And it should be unique for every project because every client is unique.
I think identifying and enrolling the right partner is so important here. What we're talking about here really is that there's a lot more to this than just implementation. A pure implementation partner just wants to get down to building and get their devs working. And as you rightly said, let's produce a BID, whatever it might be, depending on how they work, and let's get building. It's important to find the right kind of partner. And even when you get to an implementation partner, I think it's really important to take your time to make sure, check references, speak to their existing previous clients. Just be really careful. Make sure you make some good choices. Check with your peers, your colleagues in the industry. But use the networks that you have, and look for people that can give you this kind of advice. And then, again, as I said in the last episode, I'm old-fashioned. I go off my instinct. I want to get to know people. Ultimately, we're human beings at the end of the day. And look for that kind of, do you trust this person? Do you trust this entity? Do you feel this organization is going to look after you in the long term? And it's a different mindset. Most businesses exist to serve the shareholders, right? That's the theory of the firm. But there's different approaches as to what is your approach to most shareholders are driven by profits and returns. But how do you achieve those returns? What's your mindset? Do you just want to quickly go and at any cost, just put some revenue and some margin on the board? Or are you taking a more mature, considered long-term approach where I want to build a long-term relationship with this particular client, keep delivering value? Because again, we talked about the cost of acquisition. I can tell you in my industry, in my space, the cost of acquisition is phenomenally high. It's very expensive. A lot of time, energy, sales cycles are extremely long. And when you get a client, hold on to them for dear life, because if you're not thinking in their best interest long term, clients aren't foolish. People are smart. There's a lot of information, and soon everything will come out in a wash. And then you're back to square one again. It's very expensive. So the philosophy I've always lived by is do the right thing, and that will pay dividends in the long term. So yeah, I think the lesson here is be very careful who you bring on board to give you advice. Just give that stage its due consideration.
Absolutely. And as we come down to the end of our time together, how important do you think it is, or one of the barriers that I've identified as being extremely common is a lack of leadership buy-in? Maybe the sales team's bought in, maybe your IT team is bought in, maybe your customers are pressing for it and they're saying, hey, look, we'd love you to be able to service us in this way. We'd love you to be able to do EDI. We'd love to be able to do punch out with you. In fact, we're going to leave. If you don't allow us to do punch out, we're going to leave because it's costing us 1%, 2%, 3% more to do business with you than supplier X down the road. So we're going to do more business with supplier X and less business with you. Maybe they're even getting pressure from a younger generation, but maybe the founder of the company or the board or the CXOs, maybe they're just not digital people. And I think I can say this because I fit into this cohort, I fit into this demographic. Unfortunately, a lot of boards are still male, pale, and stale. That's the unfortunate thing. There's not the diversity. I still am seeing it that a lot of B2B businesses, they're legacy businesses in the sense that the leadership, they're older, they're an older generation, they're sometimes multi-generational, and sometimes the grandparent of the person trying to run the business now they're still in the business. They're still a director. They're still maybe the head of sales or whatever it might be in the business. And so they still have a significant leadership function within the business. And if they can hardly operate their smartphone without assistance, what is the likelihood? And they're not a digital native because they're 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. In some cases, even older than that. I see B2B operators in their 80s this is a very common thing, that B2B operators are in their 80s still in the day-to-day operations of these businesses. And what are the chances that this person is going to see the value of digital services in the business? It's pretty low. So how important do you think it is to have senior leadership buy into these programs of work for them to be a success?
I think it's extremely crucial, because otherwise, see, these are at times very complicated. Sometimes it requires, like I said, it requires the whole village to raise the child, and it's exactly with the project. Anything like this. So without a proper and a complete buy-in from the leadership, it becomes a nightmare. The biggest stress of any issues on the project, more than that, is the stress of handling and addressing the queries and explaining it to the management of the leader team, which I've seen burning out a lot of people who are driving this project. The champion tends to get absolutely frustrated, and he constantly keeps thinking, I'm trying to do good for your business. And at the end, I'm the one who's being beaten down.
Yeah, I'm having to fly the flag constantly because no one else is.
Exactly. So I think that's very crucial, because without that, he would just be looking around for every time an opportunity to say, I told you so, this won't work.
We have to recognize that different leaders speak different languages in the boardroom. And ultimately, it comes down to education. And I think we have to recognize that the language that the CFO understands and can get behind is different to the language that perhaps the COO might speak or the CIO might speak. And yeah, it's an educational challenge. Without the leadership backing, the risks are high of failure, or at least being caught in quicksand. And this educational challenge, we have to recognize the different languages, and we have to evangelize. And I spoke to a client 2 weeks ago, and we were having a conversation about it, and I loved what the client suggested, and it showed quite a mature thinking. And she basically said that I'm going to spend the next 2 to 4 weeks evangelizing what we're going to do here internally to the internal team. And I thought that was really progressive and enlightened, and I was really quite impressed. But yeah, we've got to get the board educated. We've got to speak in their language, in the way that they understand. We've got to understand what are their motivators, what are the KPIs that they judge themselves or are judged against. And I think by having this kind of I'm going to call it a multilingual approach in terms of educating and getting support, that is the approach that's going to work. And to Vikram's point, it's hard work. It's not easy. You think you're just going to fly in and, again, get a single silver tongue salesperson to do a presentation for an hour or two and get a contract signed. It's far from it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done over dinner, over just regular kind of constant building of trust, and at the same time educating. But one thing's for sure, it's a fact. I almost feel like we're at the blockbuster Netflix inflection point again, in the sense that the market is moving in a certain direction. Yes, you may have been the king of the castle in your time, but the winds are the times are changing. To quote,
the winds of change are blowing.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. It's almost I dare say, medium to long term, I almost see it as an existential threat.
Absolutely.
One thing is it's the risk of inaction, and opportunity cost is always hard to sell. Insurance is hard to sell because there's the risk of inaction. It's for some people it's hard to visualize or materialize. But I think the positive is the rate of change is so rapid. Things are happening so fast that these B2B merchants, whether they realize it or not, if they don't adapt, the future is going in one direction.
No question. Gentlemen, another fantastic conversation. Another hour has flown by. I really appreciate your time. Next episode and final episode in this 3-episode series, we'll be talking about concrete and specific action points for B2B sellers to take to get on to this road of digital transformation successfully. Thank you, gentlemen. Can't wait to speak to you again soon. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.